Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and really try to uncover the most important insights.
That's right.
Today, we're diving into a source that tackles, well, a pretty charged topic: cultural appropriation.
Yeah, it definitely is. And this source doesn't just talk theory. It uses a very specific example to really build his argument.
So, our mission here is to unpack how this source sees cultural appropriation, how it defines it, and then really look at this surprising contrast it highlights.
And understand the conclusions it draws, particularly about how different cultures might view this whole thing.
Exactly. You might find yourself questioning some assumptions based on this source's perspective.
Definitely. Get ready for maybe an unexpected take.
Okay, so let's get into it. The source starts off defining cultural appropriation. It references law professor Susan Scafidi
Right.
and describes it as, taking things like intellectual property, traditional knowledge, cultural expressions, artifacts, that sort of thing, from another culture without permission.
And it lists examples: dance, dress, music, language, even cuisine, symbols. It's a really broad scope.
It is, but here's the twist. The source, it doesn't just leave the definition there. It immediately jumps in with a pretty strong critique.
A very strong critique. It actually calls the concept toxic.
Yeah, toxic. And it argues the definitions are, well, ambiguous, that they change depending on who you ask.
And it also claims the whole idea unfairly targets one specific group, implying Westerners, basically.
It goes even further, saying this focus on appropriation actually supports segregation and promotes racism, specifically within Western societies that are becoming more diverse.
There's this argument it makes that Westerners are kind of getting mixed messages, like diversity is good, mix with new cultures.
Right.
But then don't actually mix culturally or you'll be accused of appropriation.
Which the source just calls oxymoronic.
So, to make this point more concrete, the source brings up a case study.
The March 2017 issue of Vogue magazine.
Exactly, which, kind of ironically, was supposed to be their big diversity issue.
That's what the source notes, yeah. And inside, there was this fashion spread.
Featuring the model Karlie Kloss.
Uh-huh. And she was wearing geisha-inspired outfits.
Now, according to this source, this is what sparked a huge backlash, mainly in the West.
Right. It says pundits, social media users. They really went after her. Accusations of yellowface, that's the term the source uses.
Meaning like an offensive portrayal of East Asians and calling the photos blatant cultural insensitivity.
The source really emphasizes that Kloss herself was singled out for a lot of criticism.
And she was basically forced to apologize. The source uses the phrase forced contrition.
It paints this picture of the Western reaction as just intense outrage.
Yeah, the language the source uses is quite strong. It talks about self-righteous rage. And it suggests this comes from people who, in the source's view, kind of enjoy feeling insulted and humiliated on behalf of others.
It even links this feeling to what it calls postmodern social justice afflicted minds, so attributing it to a specific mindset.
Okay, so that's the Western reaction, as the source presents it. But then comes the contrast.
This is the core of the source's argument, really. It contrasts that Western outrage with reactions from Japan.
The culture supposedly being appropriated from, in this case.
And it uses a couple of examples. It briefly mentions Halloween in Shibuya, Tokyo.
Right, describing it as this huge street party where, people wear all kinds of Western costumes, French nurses, police officers, where's Waldo?
And the source's point is that nobody there is getting accused of cultural appropriation for doing that.
But the main evidence, the really crucial part for this source, is about the Karlie Kloss photo shoot itself, how people in Japan reacted.
It discusses BuzzFeed Japan. Apparently, they tried to gauge Japanese opinion on the Vogue spread.
And the source claims BuzzFeed Japan framed it pretty negatively, trying to explain, and this is a quote the source uses, why the crime of cultural appropriation was just another example of the evil of Western people before asking for thoughts.
So setting it up for a negative response, according to the source.
Exactly. But the source says this attempt totally backfired.
How so? What were the results?
Well, the source states the query got nearly 11,000 responses. And the breakdown is, well, quite different from the Western reaction described earlier.
Okay.
According to the source, only 9% of those Japanese respondents had a negative view of the photos.
Only 9%. That's low.
Right. 33% were neutral. And a majority, 58%, had no problem with the photos at all.
Wow. So if you add that up...
That's 91%, as the source points out, the Japanese people who responded who were not bothered by the photo shoot.
That's a stark contrast, all right. Does the source give any specific examples?
It does. It includes quotes attributed to Japanese readers, like
Mhm.
someone named Junko saying, "I am Japanese, but I did not mind at all. No problems. The photos were taken so beautifully and creatively. Thank you for introducing Japanese cultural beauty."
Huh. So a positive take, even appreciative.
And another one from someone named Ryu, who the source quotes as saying, "Almost all Japanese take a positive view of kamarion, meaning kloss, as a Japanese cultural model." So the source uses this data, these comments, as strong evidence that the offense perceived in the West just wasn't shared by the culture supposedly being impacted.
So what's the source's final interpretation of all this? How does it explain this massive difference?
Well, the source concludes that Japanese people were basically just bewildered by the Western outrage.
Bewildered.
Yeah. And look, the source uses some extremely strong language in its conclusion. It argues this Japanese response shows they haven't been, quote, infected with the same mental diseases that many in the West seem afflicted with.
Wow, okay. That's very direct language from the source.
Very direct. It even goes on to say they haven't, quote, contracted this leftist brain syphilis that seems to have infected so many throughout the breadth of the Western world. Again, we have to stress, this is the source's phrasing and conclusion.
Understood. So the ultimate point the source is making is
That what it terms the ludicrous ideas of certain Western social justice movements just don't translate. They don't resonate in what it calls more seen societies, using Japan as this primary example.
okay, wow. That was definitely a deep dive into a source with a very particular viewpoint.
A very strong argument against the concept of cultural appropriation, yeah. Built entirely around this contrast between Western and Japanese reactions to that one Vogue shoot.
So just to recap what the source presented, we heard its definition of cultural appropriation, then its immediate sharp critique calling it toxic, targeting Westerners, claiming it causes segregation.
Then the specific Carly Kloss example, the geisha-inspired shoot, the backlash in the West described as yellowface and insensitivity, the apology.
And the source's quite harsh characterization of that Western reaction as self-righteous rage.
But then the crucial counterpoint.
Mm.
The source's evidence about Japan, the Halloween example, but mainly that BuzzFeed Japan survey showing 91% were neutral or positive about the Kloss photos.
Right, bolstered by those specific quotes from Japanese readers expressing appreciation or indifference.
Leading to the source's final, very strongly worded conclusion that the Japanese were bewildered and haven't caught these Western mental diseases or leftist brain syphilis, suggesting these concepts don't apply universally.
So the source definitely makes its case that, at least in this specific instance it examined, the perceived harm in the West wasn't felt by the culture supposedly appropriated from.
Which really leaves us, and you, with a significant question raised by this source's perspective. If a concept like cultural appropriation can provoke such dramatically different responses across different cultures, well, who gets to define what's actually harmful or offensive? And why might these perspectives be so incredibly different? Something to think about.